In the winter of 1833, on the edge of the Missouri frontier, a 12-year-old girl laid her head upon the table and never woke again. Not for a night, not for a week, but for 25 long years. Her body did not wither. Her breath never ceased. She became a living paradox, half child, half corpse, a ghost haunting the land of the living. Neighbors called her cursed. Strangers called her chosen. But her family knew only the silence of waiting. This is the story of Eliza, the girl who slept for 25 years. The year was 1833, and Missouri lay in the grip of a winter that seemed intent on swallowing the land whole. The rivers had turned to glass, thick with ice that cracked and groaned under the weight of oxen carts. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, desperate lines, struggling against the relentless wind that howled across the plains like a beast in mourning. Nights were the worst. Darkness pressed against the windows of log cabins, and the cold crept through the smallest cracks, gnawing at bones, whispering in the ears of those who lay awake. Families huddled close around flickering hearths, clinging to the fragile glow of firelight as if it alone kept the shadows at bay. This was a land still raw, where superstition clung as tightly as frost to the fields, and every cough, every sudden illness, was weighed not only in the language of medicine, but also in whispers of curses, spirits, and punishments sent down from God. The air carried more than the bite of winter. It carried dread, a silent agreement among the townsfolk that something unseen moved among them, something waiting. By day, the settlement tried to wear its mask of normalcy. Farmers broke through frozen soil with aching hands, their breath rising in clouds as they prayed for spring to bring mercy. Mothers stitched worn clothes by dim lamplight, their needles clicking in rhythm with the distant toll of church bells. Yet even in the ordinary, unease lingered. A plague of strange drowsiness had swept through a handful of homes that year. Men found slumped in barns, women nodding off mid-prayer, children drifting into unnaturally heavy sleep. Most awoke after a few hours, confused but unharmed. Still, the stories took root like weeds. Old men on porches muttered of the long sleep that once cursed villages back east. Preachers thundered from pulpits that sin had invited darkness into their midst. When the wind rattled the shutters, many swore it carried voices, faint and pleading, as if the frozen earth itself held restless souls. Fear had no single form here. It was in the silence after a knock at the door, in the weight of a neighbor's suspicious stare, in the way mothers clutched their children tighter at dusk. And as the days shortened, as the cold deepened, the scents grew stronger. The winter was not done with them. It was into this bleak season that a single household would soon be thrust into legend. Their cabin sat on the edge of town, where fields of brittle cornstalks stood like grave markers in the snow. Inside lived a girl, unremarkable to some, yet carrying an air that unsettled others, as though she moved at a rhythm just a fraction slower than the rest of the world. Her name was Eliza. At the time, she was still only a child, with eyes too large for her face and a quietness that made her seem half dreaming even when awake. No one yet knew what would come. No one yet realized that her story would stretch far beyond the cruel winter that held the town in its grasp. For now, the snow thickened on the rooftops, the fires guttered in the wind, and all of Missouri seemed to shiver, not merely from the cold, but from the shadow of something stirring just beyond the veil of ordinary life. A shadow that would not pass with the thaw. Eliza was born beneath a sky swollen with storm clouds, the kind of Missouri night when the air felt charged, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. From the moment she first cried, her parents sensed she was not like the others. She grew delicate and pale, a thin wisp of a girl whose skin never seemed to hold warmth, no matter how close she sat to the fire. While her siblings chased each other through fields of summer wheat, laughing and breathless, Eliza lingered in the doorway, watching, half smiling, as though the world outside was both beautiful and too heavy for her to step into. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried a strange gravity, as if she were pulling thoughts from somewhere far older than her years. The neighbors called her shy. Her mother called her fragile. But in quiet conversations behind closed doors, the family admitted she often seemed caught between this world and another. By the time she turned 12, her strangeness had become impossible to ignore. There were days when she would sit at the table, spoon halfway to her lips, and drift into stillness as though her body had forgotten the next step. Her eyes would glaze, her breath slow, and she'd hover in that uncanny state until someone shook her. Sometimes it lasted minutes, sometimes hours. At night, her parents would wake to find her standing silently in the corner of her room, eyes closed, face turned toward the window, as if listening to something beyond the glass. Doctors were scarce on the frontier, and those who came offered little more than leeches, herbs, and muttered theories. A weakness of the nerves, one declared. A wandering soul, whispered another. The town, hungry for explanations, filled the gaps with superstition. Children whispered that Eliza was cursed, touched by something unnatural. Their mothers hushed them, but even the adults could not help but watch the girl a little too closely, as though afraid to catch whatever haunted her. Yet for all her strangeness, there was something magnetic about her. Travelers passing through the settlement often paused at the sight of her, sitting quietly by the doorway with her dark hair falling loose around her face. They would remark, almost involuntarily, on the intensity of her gaze, how it seemed to slip past the surface of things and land somewhere deep inside. But behind those eyes, Eliza bore the weight of exhaustion. She was always tired, always sinking into drowsiness as though the act of simply existing drained her more than anyone could understand. Some nights, she begged her mother not to wake her in the morning, claiming her dreams felt safer than the waking world. No one could have known then that her longing for sleep would soon be fulfilled in a way both terrible and... It happened on a brittle November morning, when the frost clung so thickly to the ground it seemed the earth itself had turned to glass. Eliza had woken with a heaviness she could not shake, her small hands trembling as she tried to lace her boots. Her mother, already worried by her daughter's endless weariness, urged her to stay abed, but Eliza only shook her head, insisting she was fine. At breakfast, she sat at the table with her family, her thin shoulders hunched, eyes half closed as though she were fighting some invisible tide. Then, without warning, her spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered against the wood. Her head lowered gently to her arm, and she drew in a deep, steady breath, then another. Her parents laughed nervously at first, thinking she had dozed from exhaustion. But when they shook her, when they called her name, when they pinched her arms and splashed cold water across her face, nothing changed. Eliza did not stir. She had fallen into a sleep so profound it seemed more like death, and the silence that followed carried a weight too heavy for the room. Word spread through the town faster than fire on dry wheat. By evening, neighbors pressed at the cabin door, faces pale, eyes wide, desperate to see the girl with their own eyes. Some crossed themselves before even stepping over the threshold, as though afraid they might be inviting something unholy inside. Eliza lay in her small bed, her chest rising and falling faintly, her lips parted just enough to draw breath. She did not twitch, did not murmur, did not move. Doctors were summoned, men with heavy bags filled with crude instruments and bitter-smelling tonics. They pressed fingers to her pulse, held mirrors to her lips, pricked her skin with needles meant to rouse her. Nothing worked. A priest came next, Bible in hand, muttering prayers of protection, sprinkling holy water across her brow as though she were possessed. Still, she slept. The neighbors whispered outside the cabin, their words sharp and fearful. Some claimed she was under a divine enchantment, others that she was a witch being punished, her spirit trapped in dreams by demons of her own making. The cabin itself became a spectacle, drawing both pity and suspicion. For her family, days became torture. They sat at her bedside, waiting for her to wake, waiting for any flicker of movement to break the unbearable stillness. Food was pressed to her lips, broth dribbled onto her tongue, yet she swallowed none. And still, impossibly, she lived. Her skin did not wither, her body did not weaken as it should have. It was as if time had slowed around her, holding her in suspension while the world outside continued its march. Each sunrise brought renewed hope that perhaps this day, this hour, she would stir. Each nightfall brought despair, when hope rotted into dread and fear whispered that perhaps she would never wake again. To watch her was to watch the line between life and death blur, a fragile child caught in some unnatural limbo. And though none dared speak it aloud, the question lingered in every heart that saw her. Was Eliza still among the living, or had she already crossed into some other realm, one from which she might never return? The days after her collapse dragged on like years. What began as concern soon hardened into horror, for Eliza did not stir, not even when her mother wept at her side or her father shouted her name in desperation. The body of a child should wither without food, should hollow and pale without water. But Eliza remained unchanged. Her cheeks held a faint flush, her hair lay glossy against her pillow, her chest rose and fell in the rhythm of one lost in the gentlest dream. She was not dead, but she was not truly alive. Visitors who dared approach her bedside often stepped back trembling, unable to reconcile what their eyes saw with what their minds told them must be true. A living corpse, a child trapped in death's rehearsal. Even the family, watching her with unbroken vigil, sometimes found themselves recoiling, wondering if the thing breathing in that bed was still their Eliza at all. Her room became a place of rituals. Lamps burned low through the night, casting weak halos of light over her still form. Her mother pressed damp cloths to her lips, moistening them though she never drank. Her father took to leaving open Bibles on the windowsill, pages fluttering in the draught as if to ward off unseen forces. Siblings crept in, wide-eyed, then ran out again, unable to stand the oppressive silence that clung to the air around her. It was not the silence of rest. It was too heavy, too watchful, as though something else lingered just beyond perception, keeping vigil with them. Even the sounds outside, the wind through the trees, the distant bark of dogs, the crunch of wagon wheels, seemed muffled near her window, as if the world itself had drawn back. The more days passed, the more the house took on the atmosphere of a tomb, and yet inside that tomb, the girl refused to decay. Soon the town could not look away. Some whispered that she was blessed, chosen by God to demonstrate his power over death. Others spat at the mention of her name, claiming the devil had laid his hand upon her, trapping her in an unnatural state. The truth was unbearable either way, for no doctor's touch, no priest's prayer, no desperate trick of the human hand could pierce the veil that held her. She lay on, silent, unyielding, locked in a sleep that mocked the natural order. And the cruelest part of it all was the rhythm of her breathing, steady, delicate, endless. That soft rise and fall, mocking the living who stood over her, asking the question none dared speak aloud. What if she never woke again? The longer Eliza lay unmoving, the harder it became for the town to keep its distance. Whispers crept from one porch to another, carried in hushed tones between neighbors who leaned too close at twilight. Soon, it was impossible to buy flour, to fetch water, to walk the dirt road without hearing her name. Some crossed themselves when they spoke it, as if afraid the syllables alone might call her spirit forth. Others spat into the dust, muttering that the family was cursed and that their strange daughter had brought blight upon the town. Yet curiosity always outweighed fear. Faces appeared at the family's window, strangers pressing their noses to the glass for just a glimpse of the child who refused to wake. The house was no longer a home. It had become a shrine, a spectacle, a wound in the heart of the settlement that no one could ignore. Arguments raged louder than church bells. The preacher thundered that Eliza was a vessel of God's mystery, a sign meant to humble the proud and remind them of his power. Some parishioners wept at the thought, crowding the family's doorstep with candles and whispered prayers, treating the girl as though she were a saint already risen above earthly suffering. But others recoiled in suspicion. They saw not a miracle, but an abomination. They warned that no good could come of a body defying the laws of flesh and time. Mothers pulled their children closer when the family passed. Men turned their backs in the street, and whispers of witchcraft slithered through the community like smoke. Tension hardened the air. It was no longer a question of whether Eliza would wake. It was a question of what she truly was. For the family, the division cut deep. They opened their door to those who prayed, desperate for any flicker of hope, yet flinched at the stares that branded them outcasts. Some nights, stones clattered against their walls, tossed by unseen hands, while shouts of Devil's Child echoed in the dark. Other nights, candles appeared on their porch, offerings left by trembling hands who dared not knock. The town could not agree, but it could not turn away either. Eliza's slumber had become their obsession, a a mirror reflecting their deepest fears and hungers. And in that growing storm of devotion and dread, the family lived trapped between two worlds, the one that pitted them and the one that despised them. Above it all, in the small upstairs room, Eliza slept on, silent and unbothered, her chest rising and falling in time with the quarrels of the living, as though mocking them with her stillness. Seasons turned, but Eliza did not. The snow that first fell upon her slumber melted into mud, gave way to wildflowers, then scorched beneath the summer sun, only to freeze again when winter returned. Through it all, she remained in her narrow bed, as though time itself had bent around her. The world outside her window moved in cycles of life and death, harvests reaped, children born, graves dug, while her chest rose and fell with the same steady rhythm, untouched by hunger, by thirst, by decay. Dust gathered on the beams overhead. The wood of the floor creaked with age. Her siblings grew tall, their faces lengthening with adolescence. But Eliza lay frozen in that fragile moment of girlhood, caught in a limbo where even wrinkles dared not touch her. The stillness was unbearable. It was not the silence of peace, but of something suspended unnaturally, a silence that stretched into years. Outside, history marched on. Whispers of war drifted westward. Soldiers passed through muddy streets. The nation cracked and bled, but Eliza remained unchanged. Neighbors aged into bent figures, their hands knotted with years of labor. Entire families packed wagons and pushed farther into the frontier, chasing new beginnings, while others returned to earth, their names carved into stone. Yet whenever the town's stories were told, hers always returned to the surface. The girl who would not wake. Children who had once feared her grew into parents who told the tale to their own, as though Eliza had become less a person than a haunting woven into the fabric of their lives. Pilgrims arrived in hushed clusters, travelers who had heard whispers of a miracle or a curse out on the edge of Missouri. They filed into the dim upstairs room, stared at the girl suspended between worlds, and left shaken, unable to decide whether they had seen something divine or monstrous. Her bed became an altar of unease. Inside the family's cabin, time weighed heavier still. Furniture wore down, fabrics frayed, lives shifted and crumbled, but Eliza remained the constant. Her parents carried gray into their hair and stoop into their spines, yet each morning they rose to find their daughter unchanged, as though mocking the cruelty of their own aging flesh. Birthdays passed unmarked, holidays forgotten, because in that house, every day was the same, tending to a girl who never stirred. There were no milestones, only the ache of years swallowed by repetition. The family watched the world change while Eliza did not, and somewhere in the long silence, their grief hardened into something else, something more difficult to name. Was it devotion? Was it despair? Or was it simply the recognition that they, too, were prisoners of her endless, merciless sleep?
In the beginning, her parents kept vigil with a faith that bordered on ferocity. They sat at her side through long nights, smoothing her hair, whispering prayers into the darkness, convincing themselves that God would not allow a child to linger like this without reason. But as years bled into decades, that faith began to fray. Her mother's face grew hollow, etched with sleeplessness, her hands gnarled from constant tending. Her father, once a proud man who could split logs with a single strike, stooped beneath the weight of silence, his shoulders rounded as though the stillness in the upstairs room had pressed him into the earth. Love chained them to their duty, yet that love soured slowly, curling at the edges like spoiled fruit. To live each day in service of a child who never returned their gaze was not living. It was enduring. The siblings carried their own burdens, though theirs were heavier in some ways. They had grown up in the shadow of their sister's unending slumber, their lives measured against her stillness. Birthdays celebrated quietly so as not to disturb her. Laughter hushed in hallways where it might feel like mockery. Friends reluctant to visit a house haunted by something between miracle and curse. Some siblings left as soon as they could, carving out lives of their own, yet each departure carried a stain of guilt, as if they were abandoning her to the silence. Those who stayed behind often resented her in secret, resented the way their parents' entire existence revolved around a girl who gave nothing back. They loved her, yes, but in the way one loves a ghost. A presence that cannot be banished, cannot be ignored, yet never answers when you call its name. As the years wore them down, resentment gave way to despair. What began as a hopeful vigil had curdled into ritual, a routine of cleaning her face, changing her linens, moistening her lips with water she never swallowed. The motions became mechanical, performed without belief that they mattered, only because stopping would feel like murder. The family became gaunt, both in body and in spirit, tethered to a bed that had long ago ceased to feel like a place of rest. Neighbors came less often now, their curiosity sated, their prayers exhausted. The story of Eliza remained a legend whispered beyond the town, but inside her home, the legend was nothing but an open wound. Her parents aged into shadows of themselves, hollowed by years of waiting for a miracle that never came. And still, upstairs, the girl lay untouched, unchanged, a cruel reminder that sometimes the weight of love is heavier than death itself. It happened without warning, on an ordinary morning that had begun like countless others. The house was quiet, its air thick with dust and the smell of wood smoke. Her mother, now gray and trembling, climbed the narrow stairs as she had done every day for a quarter of a century, carrying a damp cloth to moisten her daughter's lips. The door creaked open, the same sound it had made thousands of times before. But this time, the silence inside was different, charged, fragile, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Eliza lay as she always had, her hair spread dark against the pillow, her chest rising faintly with breath. And then her eyes opened, slowly, painfully, like shutters forced apart after years of rust. For an instant her gaze was glassy, blind. Then they focused, and her mother dropped the cloth from her hand, choking on a scream that was half terror, half desperate joy. Eliza sat up. The motion was stiff, unpracticed, as though her body had forgotten the mechanics of movement. Her skin was pale but unwrinkled, untouched by the passage of years. To the family that surrounded her, she looked much as she had the day she first fell asleep, 12 years old, small, fragile. Yet her eyes carried something older, something heavy with shadows. Her father collapsed to his knees beside the bed, tears running through the furrows of his face. Siblings who had grown to adults now stood in the doorway like strangers, staring at the child they had outgrown. Eliza looked at them with bewilderment, lips parting as though to ask a question, but only a thin rasp of breath escaped. Her first wordless sound in 25 years. The house shook with weeping, with laughter, with cries of disbelief, but under it all was a terror too deep to name. How could a child step so easily back into life when everyone else had been aged, broken, hollowed by time? The town erupted as soon as the news spread. Bells rang, doors flew open, voices shouted through the streets that the girl had awoken. Some called it a miracle, proof of divine power, while others shuddered at the thought of what kind of creature could slumber untouched for so long. Crowds gathered outside the family's cabin, desperate to see her with their own eyes. But Eliza herself was overwhelmed, trapped in a waking nightmare of confusion. To her, no years had passed. One moment she had been drifting at the breakfast table, and the next she was staring into the faces of parents lined with age and siblings she could not recognize. The weight of those lost decades crashed upon her in silence, an invisible tide that pulled at her chest and left her trembling. She had not died, yet she had not lived, and now she was expected to rise, to walk again, to carry a quarter-century of absence as if it were only a dream. When Eliza finally stepped beyond the threshold of her family's cabin, the world struck her like a blow. The Missouri she remembered, a quiet settlement of rough-hewn cabins and dirt roads, had grown into something altogether unfamiliar. Wagons rattled with iron rims she had never seen before, tools shone with metals crafted by hands she could not imagine, and faces, so many faces, belonged not to neighbors she once knew, but to strangers who regarded her with awe, suspicion, or fear. Her childhood companions had grown into weary adults, their children now racing through the fields where she once played. She stood in the sunlight blinking, small and unchanged, a girl frozen in time, while the world around her bore the scars of decades she had slept through. To her, it was all too loud, too sharp, too fast, every sound, every color, every gaze pressing down on her like a weight she could not carry. The war had come and gone while she lay dreaming. She learned of battles fought far from Missouri, of men slaughtered and empires reshaped, of flags raised and lowered. The land itself had shifted, farms had risen and failed, families had left for distant territories, and others had arrived to take their place. Entire generations were missing from her memory, swallowed by the long silence of her sleep. Strangers pressed upon her with questions. What had she seen? What had she dreamed? Did she carry messages from God, from death, from the world beyond? Some treated her like a relic, others like a prophet, and still others like an omen of doom. She could not answer them. She could barely form words. Each step she took into this new Missouri felt like trespassing, as if she were an intruder in a story that no longer belonged to her. Her family shielded her as best they could, but even their presence was a reminder of what she had lost. Her mother's hair had gone to silver, her father's hands shook with age, her siblings stood taller than she ever imagined they could, their faces lined with years of struggle she had not shared. She had slept through their youth, through their laughter, through their grief. They had grown old in her absence, and she had remained a child. To them she was both sister and stranger, a reminder of time's cruelty. And for Eliza, every glance in their direction cut deeper than any blade. She had not only missed the world, she had missed them. Every year that they had lived, she had lost, and no waking could restore what had been stolen. She was alive, yes, but in many ways, she was a ghost walking among the living, forever set apart by the gulf of years she could never reclaim. Eliza lived on, but never truly belonged again. The world regarded her as something between miracle and monster, yet she herself felt neither. She walked the streets like a shadow, her small frame swallowed by the gaze of every passerby, her silence mistaken for wisdom when in truth it was only confusion. People asked what she had dreamed in her long sleep, what secrets she carried from those dark years, but she could give them no answer. There were no visions, no prophecies, only a void, a blackness as endless as the grave. And so the silence surrounding her deepened, not the silence of sleep this time, but of isolation. She was awake, yes, but she had awakened into a world where she was no longer at home. As years passed, her tale drifted outward, leaving the town like smoke carried on the wind. Travelers told of the girl who had slept for 25 years, embellishing details, turning her stillness into a miracle, a curse, a cautionary fable. Some said she was touched by heaven, others that she had bargained with the devil and paid her price in decades. To some she became a symbol of patience, to others a warning against hubris. Her name became legend long before her life ended, and in time, the truth blurred until even those who had known her could no longer separate memory from myth. Was she a child stricken by an illness too mysterious for her century to name? Or was she, as so many whispered, chosen, set apart by forces beyond comprehension? We cannot know. We can only picture that small cabin in Missouri, the flicker of a hearth casting shadows on the walls, the upstairs room where a girl lay still while the world turned without her. We can imagine the weight of silence, the endless years marked only by breath. And we can wonder, what is more haunting, that she slept for so long, or that she woke at all? Eliza's story lingers because it unsettles us, gnaws at the fragile thread between life and death, time and eternity. She reminds us that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only carried. And so her tale echoes on, drifting through time like the hush of breath in a darkened room. If you felt that chill while listening, if her story has left you questioning, then stay with us. There are more shadows to walk through together. Subscribe, leave your thoughts below, and keep your eyes open. For not every dream is meant to end.